hypothesis is that perhaps a like endogenous substance that is similar to ketamine is released when someone goes into cardiac arrest or when the brain is like threatened with cell death. Neurons are threatened with cell death because of they're not receiving blood and oxygen, and that this substance plays like a protective role. So makes sure that the brain does not essentially die.
What's up, everybody? From Nautilus, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today I'm speaking with Kristen French. Kristen is a science journalist and a contributing editor at Nautilus. Her stories have been published in New York, Wired, Back Channel, Guernica, Al Jazeera, The Verge, among other publications. Her recent story in Nautilus was The Afterlife is in Our Heads. Kristen, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So to start off, would you mind summarizing your background for our viewers? How'd you get interested in science journalism?
Yeah, so I was raised as a Christian Scientist, which I think some people are familiar with what that is. Some people also confuse it with Scientology, but it's so I always sort of had a fascination with science. I wasn't really supposed to study it as a child, and so of course that made it much more interesting. And I started college as a biology major and then went to English, and so I've just always kind of been curious about science, and ultimately got a degree in science journalism at Columbia, and that set me on this path.
What does your family make now of your career path, studying and writing about science, if you weren't even supposed to learn about it?
They fully approve. So we were always like kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out of the church. So we were kind of very practical about. My mother was very practical about going to doctors, even though you're really not supposed to go to doctors. And so there was always kind of that tension there. And none of us is really a practicing Christian Scientist anymore. So.
All right. Would you give us a brief summary of your story for anybody who might not have read it yet?
Sure. So as far back as the 5th century BC, these experiences have been recorded that they're called near-death experiences now. I mean, that's a more recent term, but basically they're very kind of mystical experiences that people often have when they are either, in a life-threatening circumstances, or they think they are. And the experiences generally include something that's known as an out-of-body experience, where you feel your mind has left your body and you kind of are viewing yourself from above. That's like one of the most consistent features of near-death experiences. And then there's also often like a life review, meeting with deceased relatives, encountering a kind of transcendent or ineffable kind of light, and maybe a spiritual being, and then a return to the body. And they typically they're very powerful and have transformative influence on people who have them. So, sorry, that's the description of near-death experiences. And then this story was basically looking at some of the research that's been done over the past 50 years and the persistence of claims that near-death experiences prove that there's an afterlife in spite of all of the evidence to the contrary.
So what was your impetus or inspiration for writing about near-death experiences now?
So in February, this article came out in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences that like 12 researchers had gotten together, maybe more, to kind of discuss the future of near-death experience research, and that was in 2019. And then they published this paper in February of this year that suggested a framework for like the future study of these experiences, and it was billed as kind of like a consensus opinion, and uh, basically it seemed like suddenly, or the scientists who authored the paper wanted to take a more rigorous approach to near-death experiences. But then when I started digging into the paper a little bit more and talking to people, here that there wasn't really a consensus, and also that some of the claims being made by like the lead researcher weren't supported by evidence. So that was the impetus, and then yeah, it seemed like he wasn't the only one. Like there's just this a lot of physicians and cardiologists and uh, neuroscientists making claims about the nature of consciousness and the afterlife. Um, while neuroscientists on the other side are saying, you know, this, we've studied this and we know that consciousness and perceptions are linked to the brain. So, um, yeah, we can explain near-death experiences, and the afterlife is in our heads.
So, what exactly is the argument that doctors who are exposed a lot to these kinds of cases where patients are coming in with brain injuries or other kinds of injuries and they have this near death experience, on what basis are they thinking that this supports the idea that brain activity and consciousness can come apart?
So the argument is partially based on the experiences of cardiac arrest patients, because that's where most of the research has been done on near-death experiences. Um, and the idea is that, you know, when a patient is in cardiac arrest and the brain is not receiving blood or oxygen, then neuroscience tells us that the brain cells cannot operate. So they can't have perceptions, they can't form memories, as far as we know. So the fact that, you know, people have these what seem like memories, and pretty powerful memories, makes them think, okay, well then, you know, if the brain wasn't operating, but still the you know, our consciousness or our mind could operate, then it follows that we must not, or, you know, our minds must not be dependent on the brain. But
What do you make of that? What do you make of that sort of line of reasoning based off of what you heard from other neuroscience researchers?
well, I think that because people have such powerful experiences, they don't want to say that it's not a real memory, or they don't want to think that it's not, that it's like, because if it's a fabricated or sort of like false memory, that suggests the experience is like pretend or something, and that maybe to some people seems to devalue it. But at least the neuroscientists that I spoke to, you know, said there's just decades of research showing how closely linked the brain is to our perceptions and experiences. And so the most likely thing is that it is a like a memory constructed after the fact, um, and yeah, that it's not a real, that it's not a true memory per se, but that it feels like a memory.
Mm. What are some of the ingredients that go into creating this near death experience? I think in your piece you mentioned some drugs that actually can replicate some of the features of what it's like to have a near death experience.
Yes. So there was a large study done um, I mean, there have been many studies done over time of ketamine, and the ways that like recreational ketamine experiences can mimic near-death experiences. They can, you know, a lot of them contain many of the features of a near-death experience, and I mean, a number of psychedelic drugs do, but ketamine is overwhelmingly the one that is most closely um, related, or looks the most like a near-death experience. Um, and in one study of like, I can't remember even how many psychedelics they looked at, but they looked at accounts online and then like compared them to accounts of NDEs. There's like just a huge number of both kinds, I think in the hundreds. And semantically, the similarities were closest with ketamine. And it's so complicated to all the, like the specific kind of neurotransmitters involved. It's in the piece, but um, there are a lot of reasons why it makes sense because, well, ketamine is also shown to be protective in many types of brain injury and stroke, I think. And so the hypothesis is that perhaps a like endogenous substance that is similar to ketamine is released when someone goes into cardiac arrest, or when the brain is like threatened with cell death. Neurons are threatened with cell death because of they're not receiving blood and oxygen, and that this substance plays like a protective role. So make sure that the brain does not essentially die.
That's fascinating. And you open the piece speaking, or you quote someone who went through a very profound near death experience. What was it like talking to them about that?
Um, yeah, it was, he got very emotional and kept on kind of swearing and getting a little frustrated with himself. And so, I mean, it was obvious that this had stayed with him. It happened almost 30 years ago, and really changed his life. It didn't make it into the piece, but not only did he, start this foundation, and the way he explained it to me was that he did that in order to mostly get the word out about near-death experiences. But then he also, at the time, he kind of asked, I guess, when he created the foundation, he asked his children if it was okay for him to pour all his assets in this new foundation, and broke up with his wife. And so this was like this moment. It took a while, but it's a moment of transformation. And I did feel very like wanting to be very fair to him. I'm grateful to him for sharing this very personal experience with me. So it's difficult to include all that, and then obviously in a piece that's not necessarily supportive of the foundation's view of the meaning of these experiences. So,
Right. Yeah. I mean, he upended his whole life because as a result of that experience. That's pretty intense. Um,
yeah.
can you say anything about the impact this story has had? What sort of response have you gotten after the piece was published?
So I feel like it generated a lot of comments on Twitter and Instagram, and I got some reader mail. A lot of it, challenging the idea that the brain produces consciousness. I mean, I think there are just a lot of people out there who would like to believe that there is an afterlife, and um, our consciousness is not tied to the body. And one guy wrote, what about astral travel? What about quantum physics? Clearly you haven't looked at all the evidence. And very respectful, but just, yeah. Um, so, and then I did actually get a very nice note from the Lujan Comas from the Eclipse Foundation. So they were fine with the story, which was a relief. And then Pim van Lommel wrote to me as well, sort of challenging the what he called the materialist approach I took with the story, and sending me a couple of
Mm.
papers, one of which was um, didn't seem to be published yet, but the other was in a journal. Yeah. Anyway, so he said I didn't look at all the evidence.
What do you feel about that? Do you think you missed a big portion of evidence on this story, or do you think you pretty much covered it in a balanced fashion?
Um, I mean, there's so much. I think so. One thing that this guy Stephen Lauries that I spoke to said early on when I spoke to him was that um, it's a really challenging subject because it's so polarized. There are people who have really strong feelings on all sides, and that he thinks that really the challenge of understanding near-death experiences is related to the challenge of like understanding the nature of consciousness, and that is something that science hasn't resolved yet. So, and it may be a while. So I don't know, or maybe they have already. Maybe we just published some pieces on brain ripples, but I think yeah, I think I felt it took a balanced view, but I didn't get every last bit of research into the nature of consciousness in there. So in that sense, no, didn't. There
It's a
might
big
be some
topic.
things.
Have you done any personal explorations into your own consciousness via meditation or any kinds of psychedelic drugs? Do you have any sympathy for these kinds of experiences and how profound they can be from your own life?
I mean, I've definitely meditated quite a bit. Yeah, I've tried some psychedelics, but I no, I haven't had anything quite like as powerful as it sounds like these experiences are. So I don't have
Hmm.
anything to compare it to. But um, I I don't know. I think they're fascinating, and it seems like a lot of people have them. A lot more people than maybe we realized.
What are you working on at the moment? Any other story ideas percolating?
Um, Related to consciousness or just in general?
Just in general.
I mean, yeah. Well, I'm working on one story about a new theory of consciousness that I don't think I could really describe yet. I would have to that's related to that it basically is a way for the brain to create memories, and that's the easiest way to describe it. And then I'm working on some things about whale song and big wave surfing. So those are my current.
Excellent, excellent. Do you want to tell our viewers how they can find you online to stay on top of what you're writing about and sharing perhaps on social media?
Yeah, my Twitter. Gosh, what is my Twitter? It's just Kristen French. Um, and that's probably the best place, really. Yeah.
Right on, right on. Okay, Kristen. Well, it's been fascinating talking about these weird experiences. I've never had one myself either, and I hope I don't find myself in a situation that would produce one. But thank you so much for your time, and this was fun.
Thank you.